Dear church, let's talk about the Sermon on the Mount. Maybe you've seen this series of books. Maybe you've purchased one of these books in an effort to help you better understand a certain subject. The For Dummies series of books began in 1991 with the book DOS for Dummies. DOS is computer lingo, by the way. And over the course of 30 years, the publishers have churned out 2,500 more titles for dummies like you and me. The success of the publishers has not been the result of insulting the mental capacity of potential consumers. No, they've succeeded because they have playfully tapped into the normal experience of feeling totally lost when it comes to topics like beekeeping or real estate or networking or some other subject that might be over your head. They built their business on the value of breaking down and explaining complicated ideas by simplifying complex information. And that's sort of what Jesus was doing in the Sermon on the Mount. He was taking complicated concepts and breaking them down. He was simplifying what it means to be a follower. We might call it discipleship for dummies. How do the totally lost grasp the magnitude of kingdom citizenship? Well, it's a weighty subject, and one that demands not only our comprehension, but also our commitment. And in verse 12 of Matthew chapter 7, Jesus boils it all down so that even the simplest of minds can understand. He says, "In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets." What an elementary yet profound statement. Now, we often refer to it as the Golden Rule. It is a summation of all that Jesus has been talking about concerning man's relationship to man. Jesus began with the Beatitudes. He then talked about the disciples' influence in the world as he referred to them as salt and light. And then he speaks about the purpose and intent of his coming, not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Then he moves to interpersonal relationships. Says, "You have heard that the ancients were told, 'You shall not murder, and whoever commits murder shall be answerable to the court.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be answerable to the court, and whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' shall be answerable to the Supreme Court, and whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell." And then he continues by addressing the subjects of adultery, making false vows, letting your yes be yes and your no be no. Then he really gets radical in his teaching when he says this, "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I say to you, do not show opposition against an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other toward him also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you." So our Lord is emphasizing the radical nature of his kingdom and the radical attitude that one must have to be a kingdom citizen. The world doesn't play by the rules. The world has its own set of rules. Many in our world adhere to what could be called the iron rule. The iron rule goes something like this: do unto others before they do unto you. Iron rulers want the gold, but they don't want the rule. Iron rulers use power and might for selfish gain. The lock on your door is a testimony to the iron rule. The Taylor County Jail is a monument to the iron rule. History is littered with iron rulers. Alexander the Great, Hitler, every corrupt politician who manipulates power for personal advantage, abusive husbands or fathers are iron rule devotees. Cain was the first iron ruler, and there have been countless others who have followed in his footsteps. Now, what is truly tragic is when the iron rule infiltrates the church. Remember what John wrote in 3 John about a man named Diotrephes? He says, "I wrote something to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to be first among them, does not accept what we say. For this reason, if I come, I will call attention to his deeds, which he does, unjustly accusing us with malicious words, and not satisfied with this, he himself does not receive the brothers either, and he forbids those who want to do so and puts them out of the church." Notice what John says about this man Diotrephes. He loves to be first among them. He unjustly accuses with wicked words, and he does not receive the brethren or allow others to do so. Diotrephes was a local church dictator. He bullied his way around the congregation, using his power and might to satisfy his own self-interest. He was an uncontrollable virus that was killing the church. And unlike the golden rule, the iron rule totally ignores the needs of others in favor of the desires of self. The only person who benefits from the iron rule is the one who implements it. It is selfish and self-centered in every sense of the word. And what's worse is it doesn't care who it harms as long as it gets its way. Renowned Jewish Rabbi Hillel had a version of the golden rule. It stated this: "What is hateful to yourself, do to no other." He added, "This is the whole Torah, the rest is just commentary." In the book of Tobit, which is found in the Apocrypha, there is a passage in which Tobias says to his son, "What you yourself hate, do to no man." Hinduism states this is the sum of duty: do not do to others what would cause pain if done to you. Chinese philosopher Confucius stated it this way. He said, "What you do not wish yourself, do not do unto others." Even the humanist prescribes to a form of the golden rule. Don't do things you wouldn't want to have done to you. Now, while these are certainly a step above the iron rule, they still fall well short of what Jesus was conveying. And the reason why is because they are selfish in nature. The statement, "What you do not wish to be done to you, do not do to others," has been dubbed the silver rule. It's been said that the silver rule is the golden rule in negative form. The silver rule would forbid you from stealing your neighbor's wallet because that is a bad thing for you to do. You wouldn't like that done to you, so you in turn shouldn't do that to your neighbor. But on the other hand, if you find a wallet containing $100, the silver rule says, well, finders keepers, losers weepers. The silver rule is akin to the iron rule in the fact that self is still the object of attention. That's a bit more humanitarian, but it's still about self. You don't do something bad to someone because you don't want them to do something bad to you. It's really the protection of self. And that's what Jesus is attacking here in the Sermon on the Mount. He's attacking narcissism. He's putting selfishness in his crosshairs because that's our default setting. And discipleship starts with a funeral. Before you become a child of God, before you can enlist in the Lord's army, before anything can change in your life, you must die. Listen to these words. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." Discipleship begins with death. You cannot be a follower until you've had a funeral. And this is where the golden rule comes in. It attacks selfishness. It is a manifestation of what Jesus stated to the scribe when asked, "What commandment is foremost of all?" Jesus answers, "The foremost is, Hear, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." So here's the formula as laid out by Jesus. God, neighbor, me. That's the pecking order for kingdom people. We start with God, and if we ever want to expect to get anything right in our lives, then we must start with God. We've got to get Him right. We start with Him, then we move to our neighbor. My relationship with God should directly affect all other relationships in my life. So if I want to have a prolific marriage, I don't start with my spouse. I don't start with me. I start with God. If I want to be an amazing father or mother, I don't start with me or my children. I start with God. If I want to implement the golden rule, then I don't start with me or other people. I start with God. I am third in this equation. However, that doesn't mean that I'm an addendum or an insignificant piece of the puzzle. When Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself," He wasn't saying get the first one right, and then once you've mastered it, then you can move on to the second one. No, what He says is, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's a package deal. One follows the other. These two commandments were never meant to be two different directives. They were intended to go hand in hand. How do I know this? Well, because I find the concept over and over again in Scripture. I mean, just look at 1 John chapter 4, beginning in verse 20. If someone says, "I love God," and hates his brother, he is a liar. For the one who does not love his brother, whom he has seen, cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, that the one who loves God should love his brother also. God and neighbor come as a package deal in the form of Jesus. Remember when Jesus said this? He said, "For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in, naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me." The sheep were confused. They asked him when they had done all these things because they didn't remember him. They didn't remember Jesus being the recipient. Surely they would have remembered that. But Jesus responds, "Truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even to the least of them, you did it to me." Jesus is showing himself in our neighbor. He is God and he is our neighbor. So loving God and loving our neighbor is a package deal. And notice what loving our neighbor is predicated upon. Love your neighbor as what? Well, as yourself. I mean, the implication is crystal clear. You cannot properly love your neighbor if you don't love yourself. Do you believe that? And that may be a little hard for some of you to swallow, but others' love is a product of self-love. And I realize that it may seem like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but hear me out on this. I'm not referring to our narcissistic default setting. That's not healthy. A healthy love of self that sees me the way that God sees me, stamped with his image and so valuable that he sent his son to die for me. That's what I'm talking about. The way it's often presented is that you must choose. You must choose to either love your neighbor or yourself. And if you choose to love yourself, well, then you're just selfish. But that's not the case at all. Jesus didn't say love others instead of loving yourself. Again, it's a package deal. God loves every one of us while still loving each of us as if we were the only one. And we're able to love others because of the way that God loves us. We were made in the image of God. He sent his son to die for us. To not love yourself is a slap in the face to the one who created you and the one who died for you. And once we learn to see ourselves the way that God sees us, we begin to see others the same way. So love yourself. You've been called to do so. But keep this self-love in the proper context. God, neighbor, me. In other words, my love for God motivates my love for me. He loved me enough to create me and die for me, and therefore I should see others the same way. Because God is first, I'm third. It's not that I love me any less. It's that I love God most. And I love others best when I love God more than anything. Many years ago, my son was playing all-star baseball, and I had the team over to the house for a cookout and a pool party. And all the kids were in the pool playing and having a good time. One of them decided that it would be fun to play a game. What was the game? I don't really know. I looked on from my lawn chair trying to discern what was happening, but all I saw was chaos and confusion. Because whatever the game was, it had a lot of complex rules, and the rules seemed to change as the game progressed. I've noticed this with kids and games. They tend to work out the rules as they go along. And the new rules will crop up when things don't seem to go the way one person or one team prefers. In other words, kids are always trying to devise rules that favor them. So like at our house on that day, the game turned into an argument over what's allowed and what's not. And they spent so much time on the rules that they took all the joy out of the game. Now, I'm not a big fan of the golden rule being referred to as a rule. I'm afraid it turns something that was meant to be relational into something regulatory. Jesus fought this constantly. In fact, the entire Sermon on the Mount was an effort to write the law on people's hearts. The religious leaders had defaulted to rule. God wanted relationship. And Christians have followed suit over the years. We tend to default to rules because we like to know what's expected. We want to know what we have to do to win. Anytime we sit down to play a game that we're unfamiliar with, that's the first question that gets asked. What are the rules? And related to that, well, how do I win? And it's the same with Christianity. Just tell me the rules so I can follow them and get to heaven because that's all that really matters, right? No, wrong. Rules are important because any meaningful relationship will be governed by rules. If you take your marriage seriously, then you won't commit adultery. That's against the rules. However, you can be married for 50 years and never cheat on your wife and still be a lousy husband. You don't cheat on your spouse because you love God. You love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And because you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, you love your spouse and you desire what's best for them. You love them with the love of the Lord. And it's your love for God that motivates your love for your spouse and thus keeps you within the proper boundaries of a godly marriage. You don't start with the rules, you start with God. And when you start with God, keeping the rules isn't a problem. Winning isn't an issue. There was a man dressed in blue jeans named John who walked into a bank to finalize a business deal. And the teller told John that the officer he needed to see was not in at the moment, that he would have to come back the next day. And John was fine with that. He respected her response, but he asked if the teller would validate his parking. And the teller informed him that according to bank policy, she couldn't validate parking unless a transaction had been made. Well, John reminded the teller that he had come to do a transaction but was unable to do so because the person he needed to see was not in. The teller didn't budge. She said, "I'm sorry, but that's our policy. Rules are rules." So John decided to make a business transaction. He closed his account and he took his money elsewhere. You know what John's last name was? Akers, the chairman of IBM, and the account he closed that day had a balance of $1.5 million. Closing that account qualified as a transaction, and thus the teller was able to validate his parking. Now, the teller followed the rules. She was right in following proper procedure, but she was so concerned about policy that she forgot about the person. And it's similar to what we see Jesus dealing with. The Pharisees had missed the spirit of the law. They had turned something relational into something rote and mechanical. And if you go back to the book of law, Leviticus, notice what is written in verse 15 and following. "You shall not do injustice in judgment. You shall not show partiality to the poor, nor give preference to the great, but you are to judge your neighbor fairly. You shall not go about as a slanderer among your people, and you are not to jeopardize the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. You may certainly rebuke your neighbor, but you are not to incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance, nor hold any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." I think we tend to view the old law as simply a set of rules, but this is stuff that we see reiterated in the New Testament, do we not? And whether we're talking old or new, Moses or Jesus, the Torah or the Gospels, the formula is the same. God, neighbor, me. You follow the rules because God said so, and you love Him and you want to please Him. You respond to that love by loving your neighbor and treating them the way that you would want to be treated. But the law was never meant to produce rule followers. The law was intended to produce God followers, people who wanted what God wanted. And what does God want? Well, I think the prophet Micah provides us with a clear and concise answer to that question. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. You know, it's always been about man's relationship to God and man's relationship to man. It was never about mere compliance. It was always about community. What does it mean to be a child of God? What does that look like? Well, Jesus would say this, "In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you. For this is the law and the prophets." Notice that last line again. For this is the law and the prophets. In other words, this is a summary of what the law stated and what the prophets spoke of. It is their whole object and purpose. He's probably eyeing the Pharisees here, looking right at them, the teachers of the law who had misunderstood the law. He's telling them and anyone within earshot that they were missing it. They were turning God into a referee or a code enforcement officer when the law was intended to illuminate and expose a holy God who desires a relationship with holy people. That was the purpose of the law. That's what the prophets were pointing to, and that's what Jesus came to fulfill. If you've ever driven through DFW or any big city, you've probably noticed the HOV lane. Now, the HOV lane allows you to get off the interstate and drive with less traffic on a special roadway. But you have to have someone with you. That's the rule. You can't drive in the HOV lane by yourself. You must have a passenger. And God calls us to be HOV Christians. He never intended for us to travel down this road alone. He wants us to give somebody else a ride, which allows me to have that private access. So there's not only benefit for the person who's riding with me or that I pick up, but there's benefit for me as well. Story is told of a very independent, self-sufficient man who was involved in a serious auto accident that left him completely paralyzed. He couldn't talk. He couldn't move his body except for his pinky finger on one hand. The EMTs that were attending to him thought that he was dead. So instead of hauling him to the hospital, they took him to the morgue instead. And as he was being wheeled into the morgue, his pinky finger began tapping the gurney. And at first the EMTs didn't hear the tapping because the wheels on the gurney were squeaking. The man on the gurney began to panic. He could hear them talking. He knew where he was going. He just couldn't stop it. He couldn't get their attention. He was tapping his finger, but they couldn't notice it, couldn't hear it. He was trapped in his own body. But just as they were about to place him in a refrigerated tray, one of the attendants shouted, "Stop, he's alive." And the other attendant responded, "How can you tell?" To which the first attendant replied, "I see a tear in his eye." The golden rule is about recognizing the authentic existence of others by seeing the tear in their eye, making those tears your tears and seeking to wipe them away. If we learn nothing from Jesus' teachings, or really the teachings of the New Testament, what we should learn first and foremost, above all else, is this: it's not about you. Too often in our world, people want to make themselves the center of the universe. They are the star of a show, and everyone else around them are just extras. It's a documentary about them and their life. Everything revolves around them. They are the center of it all. But to be a kingdom citizen means you put yourself second or third, as we've talked about. You're not the star. Jesus is. And you promote others above yourself. Instead of having this narcissistic attitude that always shines the spotlight on yourself, you turn the spotlight towards God and toward others. And you seek to live a selfless life of service that illuminates God so that others may see Him. You are shining His light. You are exposing His character. If you live out the characteristics that are described in the Sermon on the Mount, you will be salt of the earth. You will be a light of the world. You will be an influence. And others perhaps will be drawn to you. And you can take them along for the ride with you. Because that's really our goal, isn't it? As Christians, we are to be the agency by which the story of salvation is to be told. We are to be truth tellers with tears. We of all people know what it means to benefit from the amazing grace of God. And therefore, we seek to tell that story to others so that they can be beneficiaries as well. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Dear Church podcast. I want you to know that if you have a question or a comment, you can contact me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. We appreciate you so much for tuning in. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.